Welcome to One Last Take, a podcast about seeing film from every angle. I'm Wes Skinner, and today's episode we're talking the good, the bad, and the underrated, February 2026 edition. Hope you enjoy. Welcome back to our monthly segment of the good, the bad, and the underrated. These episodes will serve as my monthly roundup of theatrical releases, as well as some general thoughts on the film scene that I'll be discussing as they become relevant. I decided I'll already be changing up the formula for this series just a bit. Instead of picking one movie for good, one for bad, one for underrated, I'll actually be grouping all of the month's releases that I was able to see into one of those three categories. So this will allow me to cover more and give you a little more insight into what you might want to check out in the near future. Before we get there, though, I have a bit of spillover from January. The first one I want to discuss has become a bit of a phenomenon, and I wasn't initially intrigued by it, but the excitement and talk around it became impossible to ignore, to the point where I felt obligated as someone who cares about this industry to see it. I'm of course talking about the indie horror hit Iron Lung. For those of you who don't know, Iron Lung is based on a video game of the same name, and it's written and directed and starring longtime YouTuber Mark Fishbach, or as his fans know him, Markiplier. What's most notable about this project is that it was entirely self-funded by Markiplier, as well as produced and distributed outside of the Hollywood studio system. And not only did he negotiate a pretty substantial wide release with over 4,000 theaters showing this film worldwide, but it reeled in $20 million in its opening weekend alone. With a reported budget of around $3 million, with a first-time director and based on a tiny niche video game, this is a massive success. Now, the key ingredient to understanding why this film did so well comes from outside any relevant metrics within Hollywood or the industry as a whole. With over a decade of YouTube content under his belt, Markiplier built a fan base of over 38 million subscribers, with many more who are likely familiar with his work. Advertising and marketing is essentially a non-factor when you have a pre-established audience that's already been following the making of this project for years. I have to admit, until a few months ago, I had never heard the name Markiplier. I think I'm just old enough to have missed the bandwagon. But when the movie theater I work at began erupting with excitement over this movie's upcoming release, and I, the movie guy, had no clue what was going on, I knew it was going to be something special. And sure enough, mobs of people between ages of 17 and 32 with dyed hair, piercings, and tattoos flooded our lobby that opening weekend and absolutely dominated the theater for the following week. Now, anyone who's worked at a theater knows that each movie comes with a different crowd, and while there are always outliers, there are usually some overwhelming similarities in not only the style, but the overall demeanor of people seeing a particular movie. And I have to say, whatever Markiplier has put out there into the ether to appeal to his fans, he did something right. And it goes beyond just appealing to their taste in media, because these are easily some of the kindest and friendliest customers I've ever had at any job, and I've never seen such joy in people's faces getting to support someone they've followed for years. It was like this movie was a reward as fans, and given the current state of movie theaters, I can only assume this was one of the few times a lot of them chose to come to the movies in recent years. So all that's to say, the energy around this movie was infectious, and my positive interactions with the fan base was the final push I needed to go see for myself what all the hype was about. So you might be wondering at this point, after all this build-up, what did I actually think of Iron Lung as a movie? And the answer is kind of complicated. The film takes place in a bleak future where stars and planets have mysteriously disappeared, and a convict, played by Markiplier himself, is sent to investigate a moon flooded with an ocean of blood, with nothing but a ramshackle sub equipped with an X-ray camera. First and foremost, Iron Lung is a passion project, and it shows. Within the constraints of the film's budget and resources, every dime is put into crafting a very specific sense of place, which does a really good job of throwing the viewer into the sweaty confines of this vessel where the entire film is set. The sound design of dripping water and creaking rusted metal, as well as creative camera angles that make the best of the space, while still feeling really claustrophobic, make for kind of a visceral first-person experience that I imagine probably really captures what the game feels like. In fact, the atmosphere is so good that I was pretty convinced 20 minutes in I was watching an instant cult classic. Mark's acting is pretty solid, the setup is simple and to the point, and the breadcrumbs of backstory and lore that we get early on are undeniably intriguing. Unfortunately, I felt the film slowly lose steam as it trudged forward, when I realized its 2-hour runtime was totally at odds with the amount of story there was to actually tell. The second act becomes a bit of a merry-go-round of the main character seeing something mysterious on the camera or hearing a strange noise, then something goes wrong on the sub, then rinse and repeat. The film either needed a tight 90-minute runtime so that the lack of answers to the questions it poses became more of an eerie addition and just something a little extra to chew on in what's otherwise a genre exercise. Or the alternative, the film needed to answer some damn questions. An ambiguous ending can work, leaving things unexplained can work. By all means, leave me as disoriented as the character, as long as it's in an effort to create an effective and engaging sensory experience. But when the first 30 minutes already do that so well, you don't need 45 minutes in the middle with very little plot or character progression to continue harping on that sense of dread or mystery. So little forward momentum just slows things down, so that by the time we get to the respectably unhinged and entertaining third act, I was too fatigued by the excess of build-up to really enjoy it. Still, I want to go on the record saying this film is vastly inspirational and genuinely really impressive from a technical and creative standpoint. I'd love to see Mark sharpen his skills and continue to make more films, and maybe even breathe more life into the video game adaptation space. Because at the end of the day, I would always prefer an inspired swing and a miss over something phoned in and safe. And I'm glad that with recent ominous news involving the studio system, films can find success in other avenues. Though this is, at least for now, a very rare case. Something else I wanted to talk about from January was that we finally got a US release of Kokuho, which was Japan's entry for the upcoming Oscars that gained a ton of critical buzz in addition to becoming the country's highest-growing live-action film of all time. I caught a brief glimpse of the trailer a couple months back and became really intrigued, and then I finally got to catch it at the tail end of its run here. And boy does this movie live up to the hype. Kokuho is directed by Lee Sang-il, stars Ryo Yoshizawa and Ryusei Yokohama, and is based on the novel of the same name written by Shuichi Yoshida. Apologies for any fumblings of pronunciations here. The film follows Kikuo, the son of a Yakuza leader who is taken in by renowned kabuki actor Hanai Hanjiro II when his father is killed by a rival gang. Along Hanjiro's son, Shunsuke, he becomes an onagata, a male actor who plays female roles in traditional kabuki theater. He's extremely talented and quickly becomes revered in the art form, but it isn't long before his background and a budding rivalry with Shunsuke threaten to stand in the way of his journey to become the greatest of all time. On paper, Kokuho is yet another story of a man desperately climbing the ladder to fame and greatness while dragging everyone down around him. But what makes it so special, however, is the social commentary that makes Kikuo empathetic. And the film doesn't justify his wrongdoings, but it does contextualize them. This is the secret sauce that allows us to see the cost of greatness and the toxicity it stirs inside of us while still inviting the audience to root for the character despite his actions. This is best reflected in the central relationship between Kikuo and Shunsuke, who are both beautifully brought to life with powerful vulnerability by Yoshizawa and Yokohama, respectively. Kikuo's background turns noses up towards him from the start. If it weren't for Hanjiro's eye for raw talent, he would have never stood a chance. Meanwhile, Hanjiro's son, Shunsuke, is still a great performer, though not a natural the way Kikuo is. And yet he still sees the base amount of respect and success that Kikuo has fought for merely due to his lineage. We've seen plenty of these brother-against-brother dynamics before, but this one takes twists and turns that feel organic and fresh at the same time. We follow Kikuo from the start, but we ultimately become equally invested in both their journeys by the end. In fact, this film does the same thing with almost the entire roster of characters. The story spans decades and almost every supporting character is given their own arc, allowing this intimate character piece to double as a sprawling epic. That's also part of the reason the film has a hefty runtime of 3 hours, but it flies by because of the gorgeous visuals, tight editing, and a structure that makes it feel more like a prestige miniseries than a standard film. And of course, due to being rooted in the Japanese art of kabuki, it's also something of a musical, punctuated with these show-stopping theater sequences that are almost dreamlike in their presentation. They're often initially portrayed with diegetic music and wide angles, then slowly grow more immersive with close-ups of the performers' faces and an emerging score that almost elevates the viewer from the audience to the stage, and in turn kind of puts them in the mindset of the performers. The film saves the best for last, climaxing with this crescendo of sights and sounds that left me reclined in my theater chair and speechless well into the credits. Once I processed the final scene alone, the emotions of the entire film hit me all at once. This movie is just yet another confirmation that 2025 offered an enormously wide breadth of quality cinema, and even then, Kokuho might already be one of my favorites of the last year. Moving on from the highest form of cinematic entertainment, I want to mention a couple January releases I caught up with that are just good, stupid fun. So the first is Jason Statham's regularly scheduled annual early year release, a tradition I've grown quite fond of over the last few years since the instant cult classic The Beekeeper in 2024. Seriously, if you haven't watched that one, I highly recommend it. But this one's called Shelter, but the title is really irrelevant. You know what this is. Jason Statham is a grumpy old British guy who's ex-military or an ex-spy or something who draws unwanted attention when standing up for an innocent person. And now, of course, he's going to have to kick said attention's ass into the moon while saying cool stuff and maybe picking up a scratch or two along the way. Since the heyday of Jackie Chan, it's hard to think of another action star who's able to make this many versions of the same movie while keeping them all at a reasonably entertaining quality. Each one of these has just enough of something fresh to set them apart, and in this case it's a moodier tone and an impressive performance from Irish actress Bodhi Ray Brethnock, who plays the young girl Statham finds himself protecting from the bad guys. Notice how I'm not even calling him a character name, he's just Jason Statham. And as sure as the sky is blue and the grass is green, the action in this movie is pretty solid too. Statham looks great in motion as always, and there's a cool car chase and Bond villain-esque hitman who squares off with him in multiple memorable set pieces throughout the film. It's the type of movie that I'll forget about almost immediately, but then remember once every 2 years and think, hey, that Shelter movie wasn't half bad. I'm really just waiting for Criterion to release a box set of these so I can throw them on as comfort food, especially to cleanse my palate after watching whatever garbage Chris Pratt puts out next. And finally, I did catch up with Sam Raimi's latest survival thriller comedy, Send Help. And it's a Sam Raimi movie. That might sound dismissive, but I mean that as a good thing. This isn't Sam Raimi trying to push his style through a muddled franchise sequel, looking at you, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. This is pure, unfiltered Sam Raimi. If you like his style, you're going to love this, and if you don't, this definitely isn't going to win you over. Rachel McAdams and Dylan O'Brien are both solid, and there are some fun, over-the-top scenes where you can tell everyone is having a blast. Unfortunately, I feel like the film struggles in the plot department. It spins its wheels a lot in the second act, and by the time we get going places, the destination isn't really all that interesting. But if you're looking for something fun for a movie night at home, you can do a lot worse than Send Help, which is at least something that has a director's flair stamped on it. Now, without further ado, let's move on to the main event, the good, the bad, and the underrated of February 2026. As I mentioned before, I'll be breaking down every new release I saw in the theaters this past month, divided into 3 categories. That means these episodes will be a lot denser and kind of serve nicely as a neat package for all my contemporary reviews, so I can make room for various series like Double Feature and Subgenre Spotlight going on as well. Now to start with the good from February, of which I have 4. Now, only one of these is truly great in my opinion, which I'll save for last, but while the first 3 are flawed, they do hint that we're kind of slowly inching back to having a steady flow of films that are just a good time at the movies. Nothing more, nothing less. And there's really nothing wrong with that, especially given February's reputation as kind of a dumping ground for some of the worst stuff we usually get all year. The way my brain constantly ponders what makes a movie work and what doesn't, it can be hard for me not to get caught up in how close some of these are to being better versions of themselves, but they were all good enough to where I was at least able to enjoy them just fine as is. The first is the animated film Goat, starring Stranger Things' Caleb McLaughlin as a, you guessed it, goat in a world of anthropomorphic animals who wants to be a professional rollerball player and get out of his small town. As a story, there's not much more to it than that, and it's your standard run-of-the-mill underdog tale, complete with a colorful cast of characters and plenty of silly jokes and wholesome messaging for the kiddos. I will say, though, that there are 2 things that make this movie stand out. One is the animation. The studio, which is responsible for Spider-Verse and K-pop Demon Hunters, has managed to create yet another beautifully immersive world while giving it a style of its own. The rollerball scenes have a kinetic verve to them, while the painterly backgrounds punch up the dialogue scenes with their own visual splendor. The second element that makes this movie stand out is its occasional weird streak. It doesn't come out nearly enough, but when it does, the movie stops and kind of becomes an absurdist comedy for 30 seconds, and it's mostly prevalent anytime Nick Kroll's freaky lizard Modo is on screen. It felt a little like they showed him a character design and just let him go crazy in the booth. He's styled like Dennis Rodman, speaks with an unplaceable European accent, and has this weird Fabergé egg thing he sings to. I don't know what the hell is going on with this character, but I would happily watch an entire movie following this guy. I wish this movie had more of this energy, but overall it's heartwarming and unique enough that I can see younger generations growing up with a fondness for it. The next 2 are a pair of movies I think are ultimately successful in a 90s cable on a Sunday afternoon sort of way, but aren't quite ambitious enough to be anything particularly special. Which is okay. We need movies like this, and it's a much better way to fill out the year than with a bunch of hollow superhero sequels. There are at least ideas and lots of talent here, and as I alluded to earlier, these are both signs that the overall quality of films is slowly ramping up. First of this pair is Crime 101. Directed by Bart Layton and starring Chris Hemsworth, Mark Ruffalo, Halle Berry, and Barry Keoghan, This is essentially a modern restructure of Michael Mann's Heat, complete with a love for LA and its minutiae plastered over every shot. These are LA people with LA problems, and the hyper focus on that this time around sets the movie apart from others using Mann's crime classic as a blueprint. Hemsworth plays a meticulous criminal with a code, on his way out of the business. Ruffalo is the black sheep in the police department who's obsessed with finding him. Keoghan plays the loose cannon criminal set to replace Hemsworth, and Halle Berry is an insurance broker caught in the middle of it all. The movie wants to be a crime epic, and it certainly has the runtime of one. But deep down, it's a tight, character-focused thriller that thrives more when it's leaning into the character dynamics between its key players. Hemsworth plays his lead Mike as someone who is smooth and precise when he's on a job, but somewhat awkward and naive when he's trying to live a normal life, which is showcased in a series of scenes with a love interest played by Monica Barbaro. It's always amusing and somewhat jarring to me when they make these absurdly attractive and charismatic stars play shy or socially awkward characters, but Hemsworth is pretty convincing. His delivery in these moments conveys the mindset of a stunted child, and rather than putting all of the character's baggage into exposition, it allows us to see for ourselves the damage his uniquely tragic past has done to him as an adult. It's not laid on too thick either, it's simply a layer beneath this character's cool and stoic exterior that makes him more than a generic archetype. Meanwhile, a similar thing is done with Keoghan, who plays into his typical knack for capturing the perspective of a true sociopath on screen. Occasionally, his character breaks down into adolescent tantrums that make his unpredictability both empathetic and more intimidating. Ruffalo and Berry round out the core cast in welcome roles that aren't too far outside of what we've seen them do, but they bring to life the best-case scenario representations of their respective roles. As I alluded to earlier, the biggest mistake this film makes is trying to blow its narrative stakes to epic proportions, and not trusting the characters and concept to tell a simpler story. For instance, one would be forgiven for forgetting that the great Nick Nolte is in the movie by the end of it, because, well, so does the movie. He's supposed to be this mentor that's at odds with Mike leaving the crime life behind, and there's some interesting stuff under the surface there, but he's ultimately just used as a tool to deploy Keoghan's character to wreak havoc, and provide most of the conflict for the second half of the film. As shaggy as the narrative may be, it's ultimately a solid movie that makes hanging out in its world rewarding with hazy cinematography, well-designed set pieces, and a better-than-average ensemble. Just don't go expecting the century's answer to Heat, and you'll have a perfectly enjoyable time. Speaking of perfectly enjoyable times, the next one comes in the form of the Glen Powell vehicle How to Make a Killing, a remake of the 1940s British classic Kind Hearts and Coronets. Powell stars as Beckett Redfellow, the son of an outcast of an absurdly wealthy family who realizes the key to a massive fortune is just a few small murders away. The film is refreshingly straightforward. It doesn't take long to get through the setup and hit the ground running, which means most of the runtime is devoted to Beckett trying to creatively and inconspicuously murder 7 rich eccentrics played by various character actors, hamming it up to the fullest. The two standouts are easily a samurai sword-wielding Topher Grace and Zach Woods as an uber-hipster photographer. Their moments light up the screen and give the movie a much-needed dose of weirdness and energy, but it's a shame they don't last very long. Powell is serviceable as the lead, but it's an absolute mystery to me how he keeps getting typecast as an average guy. I'd like to see him chew on something a little more complex for once, but you could do a lot worse than this. Hell, look at last year's Running Man. And then, of course, there's Margaret Qualley, here to be what I can only assume is supposed to be some sort of femme fatale that complicates things and safely bails Powell out of having to be the real bad guy. Unfortunately, she continues to be an actress with a specific skill set that no filmmaker seems to know how to use properly. She always appears to be having fun, but she often completely clashes with the movie surrounding her. That being said, this is still a good enough time, but I would have liked to see them go for the jugular with the social commentary instead of playing it safe. But now, moving on, we can praise a movie with very few caveats as we turn to Gore Verbinski's Good Luck, Have Fun, Don't Die. Verbinski has had this roller coaster of a career, from revitalizing the pirate movie to the unlikely cult animated hit Rango to whatever you want to call what he did with The Lone Ranger. His knack for style and blockbuster spectacle was never up for debate, but they're often at odds with his offbeat sensibilities and dark sense of humor. But Good Luck, Have Fun, Don't Die just so happens to be an outlet for all of those, and it works surprisingly well. The film begins in a diner. A man, played by Sam Rockwell, walks in adorned in a clear jacket, makeshift accessories made of loose wiring, and what appears to be a bomb strapped to his chest. The 30 or so patrons watch with both fear and intrigue as he explains he is from the future and has already made this journey over 100 times in failed attempts to save the world from an incoming AI threat. Nevertheless, he still believes the right combination of people are in that diner to change the course of history. Now, if you haven't seen this movie and that doesn't grab your attention, I don't know what will. This opening scene is one of the best hooks to a film I've seen in years. Rockwell is hamming it up with this seamless blend of desperation, charm, and morbid comedy, delivering a massive monologue that immediately sets the story into motion. It's a genius way to get the audience involved as well, providing exposition in a way that makes sense within the story. From there, the film slams on the gas and we're off to the races, only slowing down to provide backstories in the form of flashbacks for certain characters, which nicely evens out the pacing and gets us invested without the usual trauma dump in the middle of present-day action. The highlight of these segments, and maybe the entire film, is Juno Temple as a grieving mother after a tragedy. Like most of the movie, it's a commentary on her relationship with violence and technology that's equal parts relatably bleak and inappropriately hilarious. I have to tiptoe around the specifics because this is the ultimate go-in blind movie of the year so far, but believe me when I say it is full of surprises that don't disappoint, and easily one of the most propulsive and exciting movies of the year so far. Now it's time to downshift a bit for the bad of the month. I unfortunately have 4 films for this category, some of which I expected to be here and others that I found deeply disappointing. I will say, however, that unlike last month, there's nothing like Mercy here, which was just a vapid, spineless attempt at genre pastiche. Instead, these each have an ounce of flavor that shows that they were going for something interesting, even if they ultimately didn't work. Now, let's get this first one over with, which is Wuthering Heights, Emerald Fennell's fan fiction remix of the revered gothic classic of the same name. I was surprised to find myself really looking forward to this one. Having zero connection to the source material, I was just impressed by the visual flair and bold anachronistic tone hinted at in the first trailer. The thumping bass of Charlie XCX's soundtrack, mixed with strange images and a heaping dose of horniness, had me hoping this was going to be some unabashed, sleazy genre exercise using the framework of a prestigious work. Instead, this is a shockingly boring, thematically empty exercise in cinematic edging that is void of all tension, sexual or otherwise. I suppose it's pretty to look at for the most part, but that's about all it has going for it. I came to find out later that all the interesting, subversive stuff from the book was scraped out, leaving a hollow shell of a romance story that is supposed to serve as a vessel for something more complex and psychological. But honestly, you don't need to have read the book to tell something is terribly wrong here. Throughout the movie, there are brief glimpses of intriguing ideas that immediately get shoved into the background, once again to tell us that Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi want to fuck each other. But for very thinly justified reasons, mostly involving class politics, they won't. Until they do. And then the movie just tells us they want to get together over and over again. But for very thinly justified reasons, again, class politics, they don't. Until one of them dies. And that's our movie, folks. It is the most basic teenage perspective of longing and sexual desire, and it uses its period setting and prestige gloss not as storytelling tools, but as excuses to not do anything deeper, despite the source material having way more than enough to mine from. I'm sorry if this is coming off as more venting than reviewing, but I promise you there's not much more I could say about the plot or filmmaking that isn't already captured in that trailer. From strong but miscast performances from Robbie and Elordi to a massive waste of gorgeous costume and set design, Fennell is trying to sculpt with a paintbrush here. She has all the right tools but is using them for the wrong project, and her particular vision for said project was a total misfire from its very conception. There is no way with this screenplay and this approach to this source material that a successful film was going to come out of it, no matter how many teenage girls and morbidly curious English teachers flock to see it in theaters. I acknowledge Fennell's passion and unique voice as a filmmaker enough to know that she's probably striving for more than just box office success. But if that's the case, she needs to work with writers who understand how to make her striking images mean something, or at least to better communicate whatever ideas inspire her to make a project like this. Otherwise, she's only going to continue capitalizing off of half the medium's potential as an art form. And if Wuthering Heights is any indication, that will only continue to result in diminishing returns. Now that that's out of the way, we can move on to an equally confusing disappointment that I at least came out with more respect for, and that's Mamoru Hosoda's Scarlet. Hosoda has had an incredible track record of animated films, from Summer Wars to Boy and the Beast, even as recently as 2021's Belle. That's why it's even more baffling that Scarlet is so underwhelming. The story begins as a riff on Hamlet. A young princess's father is killed by her uncle for the throne and she seeks revenge. The twist is that she is then poisoned by her uncle and flung into an underworld where the fallen from every era meet. There just so happens to be a portal in this unique underworld to a place called the Infinite Lands that Scarlet's power-hungry uncle seeks. So the two clash once again, giving Scarlet a final shot at revenge. Along the way, she befriends a modern-day medic, encounters a dragon who carries storms along with him, and breaks out into song and dance on multiple occasions. Well, she does, not the dragon, although I wish that was maybe the case. If this sounds like it's all over the place, it's because it is. Hosoda has made an unlikely cocktails of genre and tone work before, but this feels like an impulsive mashup of ingredients rather than a recipe for a cohesive finished product. The film just kind of feels like it keeps redefining what it is every 10 minutes or so until it eventually gets to its climactic finale, which is completely devoid of any earned drama or tension because none of the proper steps were taken to get there. I feel bad being so harsh on this movie. It's just so close to something I would love but doesn't work on any level, so it's a bit of a heartbreaking experience. Even the animation, which is often a bright spot in Hosoda's movies, relies way too much on CGI to feel any weight of the action, despite solid design. There's not too much else to say here other than I wish this was better. The last two in the bad category for the month share similar issues in that they have a base amount of competency and creative flair, but suffer from living in the shadows of the superior movies they are clearly inspired by. The first one, Psycho Killer, is directed by Gavin Polone, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, and written by Andrew Kevin Walker, the writer of David Fincher's 90s masterpiece Seven, something the marketing and the movie itself refuse to let you forget. It revolves around, you guessed it, a psycho killer named the Satanic Slasher, who believes he's doing the devil's work in the form of a murdering spree. When one of his targets is the fellow officer and romantic partner of Officer Jane Archer, played by a surprisingly weak Georgina Campbell, she vows revenge and sets out to put an end to the killer's carnage once and for all. Now, I want to go on the record saying I love movies like this. Low-budget, 90-minute genre exercises that give the audience what they want, which in this case is a lot of bloodshed and pulpy thrills. And to the movie's credit, on some level, it does that. And in the first half or so, it does that with a lot of craft and style. But by the time we get to a central set piece where the slasher is hacking apart a cult of false Satan worshippers and shedding buckets of CGI blood, I realized I wasn't having quite as much fun as I should be. The DIY energy of films of this scale is usually charming, but there's not really much thought or care put into any aspect of it, even the violence. Hell, the killer's name, the Satanic Slasher, just feels like there was exactly 1 second of thought put into it and nothing more. The plot does get next level silly by the end, which is sort of fun, but it wasn't enough to save this from being a forgettable attempt at a modern day VHS horror movie. Finally, we have one I almost had in my underrated category, but realized it ultimately didn't work, despite a fair amount of redeeming qualities, and that's Luc Besson's Dracula. This one came out of nowhere, and despite despising Besson as a person, I do think he adds an oddball energy into genre films that I was excited to see in the context of Dracula. However, it took me no more than 5 minutes to realize its fatal flaw, and none of the many interesting things that it does after that can fully rescue it from it. And that's that this is just way too close to Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, a film that has experienced a fair amount of reappraisal over the last decade or so, and has even become one of my favorite versions of the tale. From the tone to the costuming to the set design, it's nearly impossible not to think of Coppola's cult classic while watching this movie. And while those things are all impressive here in their own right, it's hard to resist the urge to call this Timu Bram Stoker's Dracula. And that's a shame because Caleb Landry Jones is actually outstanding as the titular vampire, and even manages to craft his own spin on the character that feels unique from the dozens that came before him. But we've seen these characters and these events play out so many times that it's officially become stale. And with so many great iterations of the story, the most recent being Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, this one just doesn't feel special enough to shine through. Even Christoph Waltz as our Van Helsing figure just feels obvious and uninteresting at this point. However, I would still insist that if you're a fan of Dracula, you should seek this one out, as there are some nice little touches throughout, some weird and some beautiful that make the experience worth it and haven't really been seen in the story before. And now this leaves me with one movie standing alone in the underrated pile this month. It's a movie that I really enjoyed and sincerely hope will gain some well-deserved love from cinephiles over time, and that's the Charlie XCX mockumentary The Moment. I can completely understand why this movie was a flop at the box office. It wasn't really clear what it was exactly from the trailers. It probably seemed too artsy for the crowd who would just want a straightforward documentary, and might have appeared too much like a bland music documentary for the cinephiles. It arrived just long enough after Charlie's Brat summer domination that it doesn't quite feel relevant enough or for the moment anymore. But I and anyone else who's seen the movie might argue that that's sort of the point. The film sees an at least somewhat fictional version of Charlie immediately in the aftermath of the explosive hype of her latest album, Brat, trying to make sense of it all and figure out what to do next. What ensues is an absurdly heightened series of mishaps, as everyone around her tells her what her next best move would be, then leaves it in her hands to take the public reaction, no matter how it turns out. For example, the primary source of conflict comes from a concert film, whose direction is in a tug-of-war between Charlie's creative director Celeste, played by Haley Gates, and controversial filmmaker Johannes Goodwin, played by an absolutely scene-stealing Alexander Skarsgård. There are plenty of laugh-out-loud moments, especially when Skarsgård's on screen, but the film is equally as interested in sharp satire, particularly in the idea that artists are only in control of their art to a certain point. Once it becomes a global phenomenon, for instance, the art seems to control the artist. And Charlie herself does a great job in her performance of capturing that overwhelming sense of no longer being able to decide what this thing becomes now, since after a certain point it belongs to the public. I imagine it was a bittersweet but ultimately cathartic exercise for Charlie to hash this stuff out on screen. And while it's an extremely niche film, I think it's a special one that will hopefully get a second wind on streaming in the near future. And that, my friends, is the good, the bad, and the underrated for February 2026. I hope you enjoyed this approach. I figured condensing all of my contemporary reviews this way will help make room to play around with different ideas and older films for the rest of the month. Like everything on this channel, though, it's a work in progress, and I appreciate anyone who's listened so far and helped support it. Next will be my unscripted take on the Oscars. I'll compare notes from my previous Oscars episode to see how I did on my predictions, and complain about any award that they didn't give to Sinners. I'll also be dropping the latest installments of series like Subgenre Spotlight and Double Feature over the next couple weeks, both of which will have the shared theme of martial arts. Partially because I just love how that sounds, but mostly I'm just looking for an excuse to talk about martial arts movies. I promise I will very soon be expanding to new platforms, including YouTube and Apple Podcasts. And if you're dying for more of my movie thoughts between episodes, you can follow me at one_last_take on Letterboxd. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.